Thomas Malthus, a great economist from the 18th century, went on a tour of Norway, which was ruled by the Danes but had a harsh climate. The few people who lived there had a hard time getting by. They lived off their small farms and anything they could catch in the sea. During the winter, the country was almost always dark, and there was very little land that could be used for farming. In this mountainous country, it was almost impossible to travel quickly. Towns were far away and most of the people didn't have much education. These are the days when Vikings took over lands and taken treasures. Norway wasn't wealthy. In fact, it was very poor. In the decades that followed, wars, blockades, and embargos made things even worse. Norway's economy was in ruins and there were famines all over the country. In many ways, Norway was doomed to stay poor and unnoticed. Yet, Norway is now the second richest country in the world if you don't consider micronations. It is ranked as the most democratic country and is one of the happiest. Norway ranks near the top in almost every way you can measure a country's wealth. And all of its people are technically quarter millionaires. But how? Many countries have tried to do what Norway has done, but they have become even poorer as a result. So what is the secret behind Norway's enormous wealth? How this tiny nation became insanely rich while other countries failed? These are the countries that have the most oil reserves in the world. They make up 84.9% of the remaining supply, but they only account for 7.9% of the world's GDP. Venezuela is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, even though it has almost 20% of the world's oil reserves. In fact, most of the countries on this list have major problems with their economy or society. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates all have problems with human rights abuses and extreme inequality. Russia has been in decline for decades. And since Gaddafi was overthrown in 2011, Libya has been in a state of anarchy. In fact, there seems to be a correlation between how much oil a country has per person and how undemocratic it is. Many economists call this the oil curse. Today, 27% of all the energy that is made comes from oil and gas. Even though the world will always try to move towards better and cleaner sources of energy, oil will still be needed for a long time. With the price of oil getting close to its all-time high, you might think that having a lot of it would be good for a country's economy. Oil is like winning the lottery, which is a problem. All of a sudden, sometimes overnight, countries start to get a lot of money, which they use to lower taxes and spend a lot more. As the oil industry grows and becomes the most important part of the economy, it begins to block out and overtake all other industries. As more oil is exported, there is more demand for the local currency. This makes it easier for people to buy things abroad, but it hurts manufacturing at home. To get elected, new politicians promise to spend more, and dictators do the same thing to stay in power. They choose to spend money now instead of saving it for the future. Often, the government becomes corrupt, and the money goes to a small group of people. Before you know it, the economy looks good on paper, but the average person has to suffer. But there seems to be one very special case where the oil curse is not true. Norway is that country, as you've probably guessed. But why didn't oil ruin Norway's economy? What makes it fundamentally different from Libya, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and all the other small oil exporting nations? About 100 years after Malthus' visit, when Norway broke away from Sweden, it had just become independent. It was still not well educated and poor. Its economy was based on shipping raw materials like wood, fish, and minerals. It had little in common with its southern neighbors, who were quickly becoming industrialist, but there were some good things about it. In the past 50 years, when international trade was free, Norway built the world's fourth largest merchant fleet. This gave them valuable skills in shipping, trade, and technology, and it was a major source of foreign currency. During its fight for independence, Norway also built a strong parliamentary system. This led to universal suffrage, worker rights, and strong social reforms. Its checks and balances and wide spread of political power made it a strong base for future prosperity. Even though their geography was hard, it also gave them access to a lot of cheap hydroelectric power, which helped set the stage for industrialization. But by this time, almost 3/4 of all hydropower was owned by companies from other countries. The new government thought this was a risk and thought that Norwegian resources should belong to and be used by Norwegians. A law was passed that puts limits on how much a foreign country can own and makes it harder to try to get a monopoly. This knowledge of how to control natural resources would be very useful later in the story, but all of this happened at the same time as the development of new technologies that made transportation much easier. Railways, roads, and new ways to send messages made Norway's natural disadvantage against its European neighbors much smaller. All of these things sped up economic growth and led to the rise of factories, but Norway was different in that it had very strong ties to welfare, education, and the public sector, which would help them in the long run. Norway would keep growing for the most part, but because it was small and depended on trade with other countries, it was caught up in the economic and political events of the early 20th century. It was supposed to be neutral in both world wars, but its merchant fleet was hit hard in the first one, and on April 9, 1940, the Germans invaded and stayed there for 5 years, by the time Norway was left to pick up the pieces of its country and economy, just like many other countries. It joined a lot of international groups and was one of the countries that got the most money per person from the U.S. Marshall Plan. The Labour Party took advantage of the clean slate and worked to set up strict social democratic rules that put a lot of focus on the public sector and centralized planning while still letting the economic benefits of private competition grow. From 1945 to 1975, Norway's GDP grew by 3.3% per year, which was very steady and strong. Norway had some of the highest taxes in the world, but the money the government spent on education made it one of the best places to work in the world. It had a strong social safety net, and inequality kept getting lower than in other places. The rate of inflation stayed low, and unemployment was nearly non-existent. During this time, Norway's economy was strong and stable, but it was still a long way from being the economic superpower it is today. Norway was no longer poor by the 1960s. It had mostly caught up with other European countries, but it didn't do much better than average. That would soon change. With the discovery of large natural gas reserves in the Netherlands, people began to wonder if oil was also in the North Sea, but there was a problem. If there were a lot of oil under the sea, who owned it? After some back and forth, Norway said that these waters belonged to it. Even though the Norwegian government wasn't sure if there was oil on the continental shelf, it began to give out and sell licenses for oil exploration. Phillips Petroleum was one company that began drilling. Well, no matter how hard they looked, they never found anything. Because of some details in their contract, Phillips took one more shot, but this time he went deeper. In 1969, the first drops of oil from the North Sea were finally taken out, and they were taken out in huge amounts. A rush for black gold started right away, and in less than a decade, Norway was making more oil per person than any other country on Earth. The oil industry grew into a giant. Thousands of well-paying jobs were created, sleepy fishing towns turned into oil superpowers, billions of dollars started coming in, and Norway's economy was changed forever. But we've heard this story before. The beginning of Norway's oil story was a lot like that of other oil-rich countries, but there were also some very important differences. Norway tried something different while foreign companies rushed into Venezuela, made a lot of money, and did little more than prop up its dictatorship. In Norway, political power was already spread out. Unlike in Venezuela, where one man held all of the power, this made it impossible for a single person or group to benefit themselves at the expense of society. So, Norway's government could not only make decisions based on what was best for the whole country, but it also had to. Norway had also seen the oil curse happen all over the world. So it knew that being lucky with oil didn't mean being lucky forever. Norway took the same approach with oil as it did with hydro companies right after it became independent. Norway's natural resources did not belong to foreign oil companies, but to the people of Norway. According to the government, these companies could help look for oil, drill for it, and get it out of the ground. But most of the money they made would go to the nation. At the same time, the country's public oil company, Statoil, would study, copy, and eventually surpass their skills. Norway also knew that to get the most out of this chance, it would have to do more than just extract crude oil. It would also have to start its own oil processing industry. That meant putting a lot of money into infrastructure, planning carefully from the center, and training its own engineers. It could have cut taxes, spent more on social programs, and thrown away its lottery money on popular policies, but it didn't. It was also worried that the oil industry would take over the rest of the economy, so it put a limit of 90 million tons per year. Oil wasn't going to take the place of Norway's economic engine. Instead, it was going to make it run faster. But not everything was great. Norway knew it wanted to spend the money to help its people, but it wasn't sure how to do this in the best way. The oil business grew, and prices went up with it. The government had more money than it knew what to do with. Then, at the beginning of the 1980s, oil prices fell and a recession started. For almost a decade, the economy did not grow. An old story about how oil-based economies work. Norway wasn't wasting the money it made from oil, but it needed to do more. When your economy depends on one commodity price, the best thing to do is to spread out your investments. When Norway set up its government pension fund in 1990, it did just this. Other governments have tried this, but their political systems made them into personal piggy banks for whoever was in charge. This made them useless for what they were meant to do, so save for when oil stops pouring money into the economy. Norway's fund was different, and the government set it up in a way that would keep it from getting messed up. The government can only spend what it thinks it will make in profits. That means that new politicians can't promise to spend more today at the cost of tomorrow. And it also means that there are strict rules about how to invest. It can't invest in oil companies or companies that do things that aren't moral. But what's maybe even more important is that it can't invest in Norwegian companies. At first, this might seem strange, but the goal of the fund is to spread out risk. The fund wouldn't be hurt if the Norwegian economy went into a deep recession because it isn't invested in Norwegian companies. This makes it a safety net for short-term domestic shocks. Today, the fund owns 1.5% of all public companies in the world, making it the biggest of its kind in the world. At its highest point, it was worth $1.35 trillion, which is enough money for every Norwegian to get $250,000. This amount is expected to keep going up. Other Scandinavian countries have had to cut their social spending, but Norway is using the interest from its oil money to help families who are having a hard time with health care, education, and a safety net. Norway still has some of the world's highest taxes, but its people never have to worry about not being able to pay their medical bills. Norway has been lucky, but it has also played its cards well and set itself up for the near future. Oil is a big part of Norway's economy. It gives high-paying jobs and keeps a lot of other industries going. Even if Norway lost all of its oil tomorrow, it would still be one of the richest countries in the world. Does this mean that the economy is perfect or that other countries should try to copy it? No, Norway has been very lucky. Not every country has trillions of dollars worth of oil sitting off its coast. However, its reliance on the public sector has hurt competition and growth, and its cost of living is one of the highest in the world. The economy of Norway is not perfect for the whole world, but it is perfect for Norway. But what about other places that have a lot of oil? Unfortunately, it seems like a strong democracy needs to be in place before oil is given to a country. Otherwise, politicians and strong men will fight for power to get short-term gains at the expense of the future. Not only that, but there must already be productive industries in place, as well as strong educational institutions. In order to make the most of the oil revenues, Norway was lucky in a lot of ways, but luck alone can often destroy a country. Norway put its oil money into investments and now lives off the interest. Most countries waste their oil money by spending it on social programs to win votes, buying luxury villas or huge desert highways, and filling the pockets of politicians. Economics is the study of limited resources. Luck is the rarest thing of all, and countries that know this tend to do well.